Hi, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Tom Cormier, President and CEO of Parliamentary Centre. Very happy to be with you today in our continuing series that explores issues related to democracy development. Really excited for today's discussion where we're doing something a little different, talking about how democracy support should be financed, how it should be supported. We've done a lot of discussion about how government should do so, but it's really interesting today to talk about the private sector and different opportunities to support the work that we do and the work that is so vital. Parliamentary Centre has been around since 1968, established to help our own Parliament strengthen its the support to committees and to members of Parliament. And gradually over the years, we have turned our focus internationally to parliaments that are aspiring to adhere to more democratic standards and also become places that are more inclusive, places where citizens' voices come together and a diverse group of people represent and make decisions on behalf of citizens. And it's something we're committed to, and it's something that we're really bringing into focus, particularly in the work we're doing in Ukraine, as this country is facing an unprecedented attack, not only on its people and its territory, but on its very democracy. So I think our discussion comes at a really opportune time to reflect on the importance of democracy and the importance of democracies standing firm and supporting the growth and expansion of democracy in other places where there are still struggles to be waged. I'll turn over to Gabrielle Bardal, who is managing and heading up our virtual speaker series to lead us into the discussion. Thanks for being with us and have a great discussion.
Thanks so much, Tom, and thank you all for joining us today. We won't take too much longer. We want to jump straight into this fascinating discussion, which for many of us is something of a non sequitur. It's very infrequent that we have an opportunity to bring actors in private giving, in philanthropy, and in corporate giving, together with actors in democracy and governance assistance, which is, of course, a traditionally bilateral and multilateral space. And yet we know that there is an important nexus here, that there is a great deal of activity going on that isn't always well understood between the two sectors. So that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to learn about how private sector actors are supporting democracy overseas today. How do they navigate some of the challenges from restrictive regulatory environments to data gaps and other. And especially the why. Why do they choose to work and to invest in this area? What are compelling cases for private sector actors to engage in what is otherwise traditionally a bilateral or multilateral field? As with every global democracy dialogue, we're bringing together both Canadian and American experts in this space. I'll just take a moment to introduce our two Canadians, or honorary Canadians, I should say. First is Hilary Pearson, who is indeed Canadian. Hilary has a 20-year career in foundation philanthropy in Canada. She was the founding president of the Philanthropic Foundation of Canada for almost 18 years and has worked for many of the largest private charitable foundations in the country. We are so honored and privileged to have her with us here today. And Michael, if I may, our honorary Canadian for the day. Michael Alberg-Sberich has spent much of his career working in and on philanthropic giving in Canada, but is in fact German and is joining us today from Germany. We appreciate him joining us this late at night. He is a member of the leadership team responsible for the development of Wider Sense, where he manages a portfolio of consulting projects that bring to bear his many years of experience on strategy of different projects in the space of philanthropy, foundation management, corporate social responsibility, and investing. And as I said, he has a deep bench of expertise in work in Canada, so we're also thrilled to have him here today. So with that, I will turn it over to our guests. As with every series, we will open with some remarks. We will have a dialogue between the American and the Canadians, and the final half hour we will turn over to a public Q&A. I will just say, last thing is that Brad Smith will need to leave for the last half hour of our event. So if you have any questions specifically for him, do prepare them in advance. Use the Q&A function to add them, and we'll make sure that we have a chance for him to address them before he goes. Thank you so much and enjoy the session.
Thanks, Gabrielle. And I think I'll kick off. Michael and I are going to act as moderators for this discussion. And I'm very anxious to hear from our panelists, so I'm going to keep it very short. But I would like to just put out a couple of provocative statements, which hopefully our panelists will address from their own point of view. I'm going to speak as a Canadian, and I'm going to say bluntly that I think Canadian philanthropy, particularly private philanthropy, has not taken its role seriously as a funder of democracy. And that may be because we take it for granted, because we think that democracy is strong in our own country, that it's a given, and that the work of philanthropy is better oriented towards other important parts of civil society, certainly health, education, social services, and welfare. You know, these are traditional things that Canadian foundations have supported. But I think it is becoming very clear, not only that democracy in our own country needs to be strengthened in many ways through more inclusive practices, but that we are not a country that can sit securely at the top of North America, insulated from the world, and that if we do not invest in democratic practices around the world, we are just as vulnerable as any country that is under attack. And of course, Ukraine is now the example of a democracy under attack. So it's a challenge, I think, for philanthropy. What can we do more effectively? What can we do with greater force and with greater conviction? So, Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you introduce our American panelists, and I look forward to the conversation and coming back with some questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Hillary. And yeah, in the light, I actually I'm sitting in Berlin, and I just came through the train station and the main train station, and if you pass through there, you know what democracy means right now, because actually there's people speak more Ukrainian right now than German there, and it's quite moving. And I think it is a remembrance or a reminder one more time how important democracy everywhere is, and not just in our own respective Western countries. So we really have an amazing panel here, and I'm really excited. And as you were already mentioned, Brad Smith is going to be one of the speakers, and he has a long-lasting career working for the Ford Foundation, with being the president of the Oak Foundation in Switzerland, and then being the president of the Foundation Center. I actually know him from GuideStar and Candid and that work, because we with Wider Sense are also a partner of Candid. And he just left Candid and is now having a variety of volunteering efforts, pursuing a variety of volunteering efforts, like being on the board of the International Center for Transitional Justice, the Tinker Foundation, and Arts for Arts. And right now, he's actually at Michigan University, and is there a professor a visiting professor at the Center of Social Solutions. So Brad, it's great to have you here on this panel. Cathie is also on the panel, and Cathie and I actually already go a long way. I at least really remember my visits at Indiana University in Indianapolis quite well. And Cathie serves as the managing director of international programs at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which is the first school of its kind dedicated to the study of philanthropy or voluntary action for the public good. And she has produced a variety of global philanthropy indices and has a very wide experience in this field. And yeah, Cathie, we're really looking forward to also having you on this panel. And then Helena Hofbauer-Balmori, who is the International Program Director of Civic Engagement and Government at the Ford Foundation. And she's also the regional director for the Foundation's Mexico and Central America office in Mexico City, where she oversees the office's overall strategy based on the premise that governments at all levels must serve the broad public interest and ensure that all people have a say. So Helena, it's also great to have you on board with all your international experience, especially in Latin America. It's great to have you here. And Hillary, now it's back to you.
Well, I think we're going to go in this order. We're going to hear from Cathie first, and then Brad, and then Helena. And then we will have a couple of questions for you as a panel. So over to you, Cathie.
Great, thank you so much. And let me just say thank you to the Parliamentary Center for hosting this conversation and for the opportunity to be here. It's really an honor to be here with such distinguished panelists. Let me start by saying that these conversations between government and philanthropic sectors are incredibly important, especially right now. One of the first things our students learn in our master's degree program at the Lilly Family School is about the three sectors of market, government, and civil society. And in many ways, the study of philanthropy is actually the study of the interplay between those three sectors. In much of the world, philanthropy is referred to as the third sector. And we know from the research that we did for the Global Philanthropy Tracker that came out in 2020, that philanthropy has tremendous potential to be a partner to governments in solving some of the world's most pressing problems. In 2020, we looked at giving in 47 countries and economies for this Global Philanthropy Tracker, and we found a combined $68 billion in philanthropic outflows from those 47 countries in 2018 alone. And that's in addition to the $175 billion in official development assistance from governments and $109 billion in private capital investment from the market sector. And that combined total is still less than the $481 billion that was sent home by individuals in the form of remittances. And this is all just in 2018. So we're really seeing a true global circulation of funding. But the countries that receive those funds, some of which are for democracy assistance, are operating under very different circumstances from each other. Advocacy organizations, for example, might have a much harder time working in some countries than others. And some countries might actually restrict philanthropic inflows altogether in order to avoid Western influence. So in the school's other project, the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, we actually asked the question, what is it that makes philanthropy work well in some places and holds it back in others? And what factors actually shape whether philanthropic organizations can even operate across borders? And we found that even getting philanthropic funds to the intended recipients can be challenging if a donor's own country has burdensome policies in place that constrain sending the funds abroad, or if the receiving country's policies prevent receiving the funds from abroad. Now, one very current example of this is the fact that Ukraine actually had a very good infrastructure in place to receive funds from abroad. The GPEI score on that factor was 4.9 out of 5. But citizens in some other countries might find it difficult to send donations out to Ukraine because of the policies that are in place in their own countries. So this information is really important for government, business, and philanthropy leaders to have in order to understand where philanthropy is working and why. What are the policy levers? Yesterday, we actually held the global launch of the 2022 Global Philanthropy Environment Index in partnership with the State Department and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, plus representatives of the Mott Foundation and the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. So it's really a cross-sectoral conversation. And the reason I mention that, the GPEI is actually produced with the inputs of over 100 experts from around the world who report on the situation in their home countries. And we know that favorable legal, political, and social factors are really key to an enabling environment for philanthropy. But we learned from the 2022 index that about a third of the experts reported a shrinking space for civil society. since the 2018 edition was published. And anecdotally, I can share that there were some countries where people were actually too nervous to even complete the questionnaire because of the political environment. So those voices are actually missing from the research. And finally, let me just say that these observations are all very high level and they speak to all giving, not specific to democracy assistance. It's regardless of issue area. But there's a good reason for that. There's actually research. Catherine Harold at Syracuse has done some interesting research in Egypt, where she found that the organizations that were doing even small scale grassroots community development work were also doing democracy building in the process, but they were doing it in a subtle way to avoid detection by the authorities. And I think that's an important observation to make in a world where there is a shrinking space for civil society and a lot of pressure on advocacy organizations in certain places. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathie. And I guess the very quick reaction now would be, because you said it's on a very high level, is really that question back to you. What actually does work when it comes to non-state giving, when it comes on promoting international democracy? When you look at your index and look at your cases, what did you find out? What works well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think just to take the example from Ukraine again, even since that edition was published, the contributing expert has been tracking the legislative changes that have been made in the face of the emergency. So since the invasion, they have immediately changed some of the customs regime to facilitate faster delivery of humanitarian assistance. So for example, before the invasion, there were maybe some improvements that were on the table. And since then, they've been able to remove taxes on, for example, modular housing, clothing, and basic needs, so that there's no delay in processing those kinds of in-kind contributions. That's just one example, but I would point everyone to the Global Indices website. It's globalindices.iupui.edu, because each country has an in-depth report that really goes into the policy levers that are effective in those areas.
Thank you.
Brad, I think you're our next speaker.
Okay, good. All right, thank you. Just waiting to be queued up.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. That's
All right, okay. I guess we have an
Okay.
uninvited dog here with us too somewhere. So
not my dog this time.
not mine, definitely. Well, that was a great introduction. I'm going to dive sort of into a bunch of data because Candid, the organization, which I worked with until very recently, they're formed by the merger of Foundation Center and GuideStar, and essentially sort of a data and information service for the philanthropic sector, in the same way that Bloomberg is that for the investment and financial markets. I want to talk first about what we know about foundation assistance for democracy in the United States. And I think one thing, building on what Cathie said, definitions are incredibly important here. And there is significant funding that may not be labeled as democracy, but clearly contributes to strengthening democracy. Then Foundation Center, actually before the organization was Candid, started an effort in 2013 at the invitation of the Hewlett Foundation to work with a group of American foundations, including Ford, Carnegie, Open Society, Rockefeller Brothers, MacArthur, and others, to really map the landscape of democracy funding. The Hewlett Foundation wanted to start a new initiative to combat hyperpolarization in American politics and wanted to see what others were doing first. So just to give you an idea how difficult it is to define democracy, working with program officers from these foundations, it took us a year to come to agreement. And part of this is because democracy is so big and is connected to so many things, but also has something to do with the nature of foundations. Program staff at foundations are very enamored with their initiatives and the names they give each of their programs. And sometimes it's kind of hard to find a common language to mash up all that data. But we finally did, and we created a classification system or a taxonomy for democracy. That classification system defined democracy as having several major components. Support for democracy, that is. The first grouping was campaigns, elections, and voting. The second was civic participation. The third was government processes themselves. And the fourth, which was hotly contested at the time, we were doing this around, again, 2013, was media. There were pitched battles for people that felt that support for media funding doesn't have anything to do with democracy, and others that said, well, yes, it does. And in retrospect, it was a good thing that we included media, because shortly thereafter, there was the Trump election in the United States, there was fake media, there was fake news, all this started to happen and began to contaminate the political process around the world in a major way. So there's four big headings: campaigns, elections, and voting, civic participation, government processes, and media. And then nested categories, 18 subcategories within those. For example, campaign finance, or civic education, or judicial selection, how judges are chosen, media access and policy. So just reviewing the data that has been pulled, and you can see this data yourself, actually, if you go to democracy.candid.org. It's a free public website maintained by Candid, which displays all this data. You can see it right down to the individual grant. It's a great tool to sort of investigate this, as however you need to. What that shows is that since 2011, which is when the data began, it goes back to 2011, there's been about $13.9 billion spent by American foundations in support of democracy in America. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot. $13.9 billion is a lot of money. But it's really, it's less than 2% of the overall amount that foundations gave during that same period. So it's not near as big a priority as things like education or health, for example, or even environment. And the other important thing to note about this data is that the funders span the ideological spectrum. It's really, we have to recognize that democracy is about process, not just outcomes. For example, a really good example of this is the two grantees you'll see in this data in the judicial selection category are the Federalist Society and the Brennan Center for Justice. And the Federalist Society adheres to a judicial philosophy known as originalism, which is basically that the Constitution should be interpreted according to the intention of the founding fathers. And the Brennan Center really adheres to a different kind of judicial philosophy, that the Constitution is a living document to be interpreted as society evolves. Both these, the funders and both of these organizations feel that they are promoting democracy, but the outcomes of their work is really very different. So it's important, this is something that's quite unique about democracy as a field of support. Now, foundations have a comparative advantage in doing this kind of work. While their resources pale in relation to government spending, foundations can fund things that governments cannot or will not often fund. For example, advocacy and organizing. So if we actually get into the data more deeply, it shows that the largest categories of grant making in the US for democracy have been voter education, registration, and turnout, issue-based civic participation, which is a fancy term for advocacy, civil liberties, and support for journalism. Now, these are not things that government goes to and foreign aid goes to originally for all sorts of reasons. Now, turning briefly to international, the data about democracy funding by US foundations overseas is relatively good. because of the reporting requirements imposed on US foundations by the Internal Revenue Service. When we go overseas, there's still data, but it's not by any means comprehensive, but still we can see some trends. Candid has tracked some $4 billion in democracy funding going to organizations outside of the United States. Now, that comes from about 300 US-based foundations and about 350 foundations located in other countries around the globe. And some of the biggest players outside of the US, the foundation players, are the Oak Foundation in Switzerland, Comic Relief in the UK, and the Africa Women's Development Fund in Ghana. So there are foundations around the world that are supporting democracy. And I just want to leave you with three key takeaways. The first is that Western democracies, particularly the US and others, have lost quite a bit of credibility when it comes to, given the undemocratic forces at work in their own societies and their support for those kinds of forces in other countries around the world. So the credibility is not there in the same way it was, and certainly cannot be taken for granted. Now, private foundations, while they can be criticized on many grounds, and we'll probably get into that in the question and answer, have growing importance and even greater potential to support democracy as governments suffer problems of credibility and official development assistance continues to be reduced. And then the last thing I want to leave you with, assuming that there may be some philanthropists in the audience or people that advise philanthropists or work at foundations, if you're a new foundation or even one founded decades ago and want to do something about the global decline in democracy, there's really never been a better time. The work is not easy, and there are growing challenges. We've heard about some of them with regulatory environments, repression in other countries, war, as we're seeing now in the Ukraine. But there are thousands of private foundations supporting democracy. And you can turn to them to learn from their experience, find funding gaps, and collaborate for greater impact. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks. That's great, Brad. Really interesting. I think in the interest of time, we'll go straight to Helena, and then we'll come back, Michael and I, with some questions to you. Helena?
Thank you very much. And thank you for the Parliamentary Center for this invitation. It is an honor to be here with you and to address this very important issue. I want to follow on Hillary's provocative opening statement and the last piece of what Brad shared with us, and want to do so by saying that while democracy assistance is not only possible, it is actually extremely urgent. According to Freedom House, the threat against democracy is the result of 16 consecutive years of decline in global freedoms. 60 countries suffered declines in democracy over the past year. The Civic Monitor reports that by 2022, only 39 countries around the world enabled and safeguarded positive civic space conditions. The International Center for Not-for-Profit Law reports a worldwide wave of COVID-related emergency declarations with limited considerations for human rights and privacy. 62 countries passed during the pandemic measures that affect freedom of expression. 156 countries passed measures that affect freedom of assembly, and 61 measures that affect privacy. The Democracy Index in 2021 highlighted that only 21 countries, 6.4% of the world's population, live in full democracies, while 59 countries live in authoritarian regimes. So as Brad was saying, if you are interested in strengthening democracy because you recognize that today nobody is safe in their little isolated democratic environment, this is the best time to do it. And there are very good examples of where Canada has been played a leadership role or Canada has been a partner in important initiatives to strengthen democracy. As it was said, as it has been said by my colleagues on the panel, democracy assistance can be understood in many different ways. For us at Ford Foundation, it is essential because it is the core of our theory of change is that citizens and people have a say or have to have a say in the decisions that affect them and in shaping the conditions under which they live. As you know, our main area of work is the fight against inequality, and you cannot conceive the reduction of inequality if you don't think about the power of different people in the systems under which we operate. So let me go back to this idea that Canada has had outstanding roles in efforts that address democracy. The most important one that comes to mind, obviously, is the Equality Fund and the outstanding contribution that Canada had and the leadership role that it played in resourcing the feminist movement across the world through a combination of bold government funding, which attracted powerful multi-sector philanthropy. Another example of these cases in which Canada plays a critical role for democracy across the world is Lifeline, a critical assistance fund for embattled CSOs. Lifeline is a consortium of 7 international NGOs supported by 20 governments and foundation donors that aims to push back against civic space threats. And governments like the US and Canada play critical roles within this structure. It can be underscored that both Canada and the US pledged more resources to the consortium of Lifeline at the Summit for Democracy last year. So while we have these excellent examples of Canadian investments in democracy assistance and of collaborations with private philanthropy, and these thousands of opportunities for collaboration with private philanthropy across the world. The challenges confronting democracy assistance today by authoritarian trends, and most recently by the war in Ukraine, are fundamentally calling into question the international rules-based order. And we have to take this seriously. They demand from all of us to be much more intentional, much more strategic in our collaborations in order to bring scale and unity of responses in a moment in which threats are coming from all possible sides. I will stop here for us to go into the conversation, into questions and answers, and for me to go more into detail of what Ford does specifically, if that is of interest.
Terrific. Thank you, Helena. Very interesting comments indeed. And, you know, I think that the 3 panelists and the way in which you have painted a portrait of both government and private giving to strengthen democracy and how those may intersect or not, I think it's a very interesting topic to delve into. I think what I'm hearing from the 3 of you is there's a need, there's an opportunity, and there are also some barriers to philanthropy's role in strengthening democracy. So perhaps we could ask a couple of questions, Michael and I, about those 3 things, about the need, the opportunity, and the barriers. And of course, those things are going to be different in Canada and the United States, but not that different. I think there are more similarities than there are differences between our 2 countries here in this question of the role of private giving in strengthening democracy, both internally and abroad. And I don't think that there should be an artificial division between what we do domestically and what we do internationally. I think they should be part of a set of strategies really that private givers, private funders should pursue. But I'll focus on perhaps the need and the opportunity, and I'll let Michael ask about the barriers. You know, Brad, you I think were making a pretty powerful case for support in appealing to funders that that they should seize this opportunity. In what ways, and then perhaps I'll direct this to Brad, but I'd invite Cathie and Helena as well to contribute. In what way can we strengthen that case for support? In what way can we make that case compelling to funders? You've pointed out, I think, Brad, in your data, and I think Cathie was saying the same, that in spite of all the power and breadth of American philanthropy, we're not seeing a lot of it being devoted to the kinds of things that you outlined, great definitional categories, Brad, which help us think about, what are the various possibilities around strengthening democracy. But there's still relatively little money and relatively little time being devoted to what I think is a huge opportunity. So perhaps you could all expand on that. What is the case for support? Why is it that this is something as important, if not more important, than climate change or than supporting education in marginalized communities or improving the health system? How do we make that case?
Well, I think part of it is a problem of, as I started out, of sort of definitions, right? This data exercise I described was specifically focused at funders that intentionally were trying to do something to improve or save democracy in the United States at a time when the risk of hyperpolarization seemed imminent, and if anything, they've become worse since then, right? So, but that is not to say that there are sort of democracy adjacent funding going on. You could clearly make a case. I mean, the most interesting thing I think that's happened in the past few years has been the emphasis in the United States, not only in the United States, on racial equity and racial justice, because at its core, this is a fundamental challenge for democracy. We're actually, we're seeing it in the Ukraine crisis too. We're seeing that the treatment that Ukrainian immigrants are getting in Europe is very different than immigrants that came in from Syria or Northern Africa. There's a racial element, a racial component to all this. So you could argue that people that are working and fighting for racial justice and racial equity are fundamentally trying to support democracy. So I think that's part of it. The other thing has to do with the nature of philanthropy itself. There's no such thing as a central planning ministry for philanthropy. Philanthropy, clearly has the defects of its virtues. Its virtues are that these are, in at least the kinds of philanthropy I was talking about, are endowed foundations that have a tremendous amount of independence. They don't have to get elected. They don't have to raise money. They don't have to sell, cell phones, Samsung versus Apple. They're free to do lots of things, but their very freedom is also what makes them very individualistic. That coupled with the giving traditions and giving cultures, not in the United States, but in most of the world, around privacy, keeping a low profile for all sorts of reasons, there's just not a lot of information shared between foundations. So to understand what foundations collectively do on almost any issue is a huge methodological challenge. So I think that's part of it. But all that said, foundations are like any other sector. If you think about your own life, you tend to learn and trust when it comes to your work people that do similar work. If you're a program person, you talk to people that are a foundation person in other foundations. If you're an academic, you talk to people in academia. If you're a consultant, you sort of talk to consultants. foundations learn from foundations. So making this data available, making it transparent, creating this sort of treasure chest of examples that people can look into, so they don't have to do what philanthropy does too much, which is recreate the wheel. You know, foundations are always sort of starting initiatives de novo without really looking at what others have done and learning from it. So the impact or efficiency or effectiveness of that philanthropic giving could be increased tremendously through greater information sharing and collaboration.
Oh, I couldn't agree more on that. Absolutely. Cathie or Helena, do you have comments on this? How do you make this case more? How do you build this case more strongly? How do you get them to collaborate? How do you get them to not keep reinventing wheels?
This is such a great question, and I really appreciate Brad's comments, because I've been kind of thinking about how do I wrap my arms around this. I would say that in the United States, we have such a tradition of pluralism that maybe that's not the goal that we want, to have everyone on the same page and going in the same direction. And I say that because, you know, in addition to the diverse philanthropic foundations that Brad mentioned earlier, within the nonprofit sector in the United States, we can have organizations pursuing completely opposite goals. And that is part of our democracy. And so it's messy. And so in trying to think about how to make that case and address it, one of the ways that I'm kind of conceptualizing it is that governments are kind of operating at this macro level. And to the point Brad and Helena made, the foundations are maybe more of an organizational meso level. And so there's more flexibility there. And so that innovation to maybe experiment a little bit without the stakes being quite so high gives foundations a place and nonprofit organizations a place to experiment and innovate, but they also don't have as much funding. So if something works really well, then it can be handed off to the government to scale up. And then finally, at the micro level, we have individuals. And one of my research areas is exchange of persons programs. And just looking at history, you know, we've been talking about this question of aligning private initiatives and government initiatives. During the Cold War in the United States, there was very clear alignment, right? The government was funding the Fulbright programs that were ensuring that there was that person-to-person public diplomacy. But then the Ford Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, Rockefeller Foundation were also funding these fellowship programs. And that continues, you know, look at the MasterCard Foundation in Canada, for example. And so that's maybe where you build the trust. And trust is such an important part of this work in the philanthropic sector. So those are just a couple of comments.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Cathie. Yeah, very interesting, that comment about alignment of government and private philanthropy, which actually I have to say, and Helena mentioned that Equality Fund, so maybe I can draw her out a bit on that. You know, this is a great Canadian government initiative. I don't see a lot of private philanthropy in Canada piling on, though. And, you know, one could, perhaps this is starting to shade into the questions Michael is going to ask about barriers. But Helena, I'm going to ask you to add to the case for support before we start talking about all the reasons why foundations and funders are not getting engaged.
I think that it is extremely challenging to try to categorize democracy, support, and assistance, and it quickly takes us into fields that private philanthropy does not want to engage it or cannot engage in, which is electoral issues particularly. It is voter education and it is voter registration, but it is not certainly anything that is related to electoral campaigns. But I think that democracy, I mean, can be understood as so much more than that. And I want to go back to the example on racial justice and racial equity. For us, the work on racial justice is part and parcel of democracy work, because it is a matter of giving voice and increasing the visibility and the leveling the playing field for everybody within a society. So we cannot talk as about democracy only as the institutions that sustain democracy, even though those are essential and those are certainly under attack in many different places around the world. And at a certain point, it happened definitely in the US, and it came to be something that was much more palpable than it used to be before in the US. But there are so many things that are related to enabling the participation and the voice and the decision making of all kinds of communities. For example, our programs on natural resources and climate change, they focus very much on the voice that communities that are affected by climate change or that can contribute to a balance have to play in the decisions that are being made and in the discussions that happen. So what is the role, for instance, of indigenous communities in countries where land and forests, for instance, are in control of indigenous communities, but are being pushed away into another kind of investments, and what role those communities have to play. So for us, putting the communities at the center, and that is also where Ford's investment and reliance on organizations and grassroots organizations in countries comes from, stems from the idea that these communities, particularly the underprivileged ones, have a role to play. And by playing that role, we're building into democracy.
Yeah, no, that's very powerfully put. And I do think that in this broader vision of democracy, I do see Canadian foundations shifting into a greater awareness of the importance of empowerment, of inclusion, of supporting voice, of bringing underrepresented groups and communities into decision-making. There is definitely a shift that I am seeing within Canada. Not so sure that that is happening yet in terms of our external commitments, but that gets us into a discussion about barriers. Why is it that it is difficult for funders to start to think globally and transfer funds globally and work globally? So Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Helena. And everything you said now in the discussion already, I like that observation that Socrates once said about philanthropy, that it, in regards to the state, should be the gadfly biting a sluggish horse. So, but actually that gadfly takes a risk. And I think this democracy funding is a lot about risk taking. And there I'm really wondering, because I see that as the core barrier, because let's face it, very honestly, even certain political engagements by foundations in Canada were a problem within the Canadian democracy. And we see the same in Germany, and you see the same in other European countries, you see the same in the US. So for myself, really is the question, how do you deal with that democracy funding in the end is to a certain extent is perceived as a political activity. And when many foundations hear the word political, they hide away. Brad, any
Maybe Brad,
reaction?
Yeah. We get Brad to speak because at the same time, we know Brad has to leave shortly. So Brad, if there's any other concluding remarks as well that you want to make.
I can probably stay 10 minutes after the hour, I think.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just got a message from my other meeting. So the barriers are there. Talk about, Anglophone countries, essentially, US, UK, Australia, Canada. Canada is also Francophone, but there's a lot of in the legal tradition. There are public policy frameworks which try to set the boundaries for what is permissible political activity by foundations. And Helena mentioned something about campaigns. Actually, in many countries, those regulations are really quite specific and quite detailed and poorly understood by foundations. and usually over-interpreted in a conservative way. I think it was Dwight McDonald actually writing many years ago about the Ford Foundation in a famous book wrote that large foundations are timid beasts,
yeah.
Which is a great comment. If foundations actually get the right advice, the right legal advice, and do their homework, there's an enormous amount of things they can do that don't run afoul of legal things. And then there's tactical things they can do about being smart about their funding and how they're perceived by the public and things like that. So, long way to say that foundations can do much more than they think in intervening in things that are political with a small p. So that in of itself is not, a bright shining line.
Yeah.
What's happened, I think, that is much more complex, and people have mentioned, the International Center for Nonprofit Law, is there has been a lot of copycat legislation going around the world to restrict access to foreign funding, registration of local nonprofit organizations, what areas they can work in, what they can't. And these are quite worrisome. At the extremes, there are foundations, like the Open Society foundations that were declared an enemy of the state and expelled from the Soviet Union. I worked, I'm sorry, for Russia. I worked many, many years ago for a foundation, the Inter-American Foundation, which had been expelled from Brazil, actually, at one point, when there were sort of bilateral tensions going on, and it was suspected that the foundation was supporting, or at least alleged, opposition, actually armed guerrilla groups. That was the accusation that was made. So those trends are growing, and what's worrisome is that the legislation is closing a lot of the loopholes that used to exist. What foundations used to do is, if you couldn't fund a human rights organization in Egypt, that same organization would register itself in Sweden, and you could make the grant to Sweden. But if you take a close look at the new Chinese legislation, or the recent Chinese legislation, they've closed that loophole too. Okay. You can't support essentially an offshore or representation of an organization in a home country. So it's getting harder, but what all that means is that people have to work smarter. I mean, I worked in a number of authoritarian countries, both living and working, and then funding through Ford Foundation, Oak, and others. And I remember this one Brazilian group that it was called the Luiz Freire Cultural Center during the dictatorship in Brazil. And when the new republic started and the military, left power, they changed their name to the Luiz Freire Center. They dropped cultural. And I asked them, I said, well, what are you going to do if the military comes back? They say, well, we'll just go back to being the cultural center. So, people on the ground, Helena mentioned, if you're working with the right people on the ground, they're your best source of advice. They live day in, day out navigating these environments. And, people that want to do the right thing find ways to do it. But you should have no illusions. If you're a funder and you're going to be working in these areas, you're messing with power and the distribution of power. And the more impact you have and the more effective you have, the more pressure you're going to come under. So you also, as a funder, need to organize yourself and line yourself up internally to navigate that kind of pressure in the most intelligent and effective way possible.
Thank you, Brad. Cathie, in your index, do you see also there how people are dealing with, I think you called it, you mentioned already in your introduction, the shrinking space for civil society. Do you also see, do you see creative solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll answer a couple different ways. Within the index, each report is written by someone working in that country who is at the level of usually thinking at the national level about these policies. And so we offer them a chance to make some specific recommendations within each country report. So I'll put a link in the chat, because I think it really does depend on the environment within each country. And the good news is that, I know others have alluded to this, the social environment for philanthropy, the urge to give, is actually universal. So that part's easy. right? Then we can get into the questions of tax incentives, the cross-border legislation, those kind of legal regulatory barriers that might be really high registration costs, for example. And so this research is really there for funders and advocates to utilize in order to advocate for better policies. But I also wanted to mention that in my work, I also host people from around the world. And I've had the opportunity to meet some really remarkable people who don't live in democracies, who admire the democratic principles, who admire the United States despite all of our blemishes. And I think it's just so important to have that opportunity to listen. And so in terms of thinking like a funder and thinking about the barriers, I agree. Listen to the people you want to work with and learn from them, because they understand the situation so much better than we can.
Thank you. Helena, the one barrier you really would like to get rid of when it comes to supporting democracy internationally?
Currently, the one barriers that I would really like to get rid of are those that emanate from the counterterrorism policies and the Financial Action Task Force and Global Counterterrorism Forum, which have had an immense impact on civil society. As Brad was saying, there is a handbook going around the world about how to restrict civil society. And these international bodies have played an enormous role in giving ammunition to countries that want to restrict civil society. The Financial Action Task Force actually issued last year a document analyzing the unintended consequences of its directives and inviting governments to really deconstruct the use of these directives in a way that is negative to civil society and to civil society organizations. I think that there is this possibility. I mean, these mechanisms were created by governments, and governments have the possibility to deconstruct their negative consequences. And I think that if we are really concerned about democracy around the world, it is not enough to talk about it or even to support it. Our governments can also play the role they have in back pushing some of these criteria and regulations that have become standard and that are unnecessarily harmful to civil society. Also, just to go back to, this is a battle with power, and we will be messing with power. Yes, we are messing with power. And for Ford, for instance, working against inequality is precisely related to power. There is something that we have learned with working with organizations and working to strengthen the voice and the movement and the capacity of people to determine their own systems and future. And it is that the more flexible the support that we give, the better. The more philanthropy often thinks that the more it constrains its support by offering project support to organizations, the safer they are. Yeah. Because actually it is becoming very limited what they can do. But this very limitation makes these organizations more vulnerable, less resilient, less adaptive, and ultimately it becomes very clear what it is that you as a foundation are actually telling or allowing organizations to do. When we lean into long-term, general, unrestricted support for organizations, what we actually allow is for these organizations to define what it is that they need to do to tackle the challenges in which they live.
Yeah, and Helena, I think this is really important because that's another thing that plays really an important role when it comes to democracy funding, all the movements that are happening in philanthropy right now, like trust-based philanthropy and modern grant making, and back here it's called Trust Creates Impact, which are about being more flexible in your funding, being more open, being more transparent, and in the end also being a lot more participatory in getting grantees involved, why that money should be given for something. So I think in that context, these movements also play a very important role. Hillary, there's one more question, I think.
Well, I think we have a question in the Q&A that is addressed to us. So I'll read it out. Can someone speak to the importance of blended finance in bolstering philanthropic democracy assistance? So that's coordinating perhaps among willing collaborators in private sector banks, multilateral institutions, and NGOs. And I think that's interesting because it's also connected to a second area that's also identified by our questioner, which is how can organizations ensure facilitated partnerships, procurements, and tenders especially with the private sector, and that those things remain grounded in principles of local ownership, sustainability, and equity. Now, that's a huge set of questions, but I think it goes to this question of how do you collaborate? How can civil society organizations, including philanthropy, work more effectively with private sector organizations to bolster democracy assistance while still remaining very grounded in those principles of local ownership and equity?
Let me jump in on that for a minute. You know, on the first part of this about blended finance, and I think there's two ways to think of blended finance, but if we're thinking of, collaboration between, foundations, philanthropy, government, private sector, I would argue that actually when it comes to democracy support, that's not always the best idea. Partly because the most, if you look back over history, where philanthropy has played an important role in things like the anti-apartheid struggle, human rights struggles in different parts of the world. That was funding that took place over a very long period of time and was consistent and maintained an important degree of independence. And there were ebbs and flows in foreign policy of official governments at the time, and sometimes foundations found themselves supporting things that were, very much against where government was, and it would have been a liability to be involved. So I think sometimes, especially I think for things like vaccine development and a lot of public goods development, there's a strong argument to be made for that in terms of scale and the comparative advantage of each sector. But I'd be careful about having foundations get sort of too close to government and too close to foreign policy in some cases. On the second question, this is a big dilemma. It's not a dilemma really for private philanthropy, because private philanthropy doesn't fundraise, right? It's endowed, or at least the kind I've been talking about. It's a huge problem for ODA, because one of the ways that governments sell increased ODA to parliaments and parliamentary bodies is to basically assure them that there'll be buy Canadian provisions or buy American provisions, and that of every dollar 81 cents will actually go back to the American people. So there's sort of countervailing pressures working at that. But I think some of the kinds of things Helena was talking about too, there's also countervailing forces to that too, where people are advocating more and more for more local ownership and more control. The other type of blended financing, I was wondering if people was in that question, is if you take something like the Omidyar, fund, their notion of blended network is that they use full market rate they'll see a problem in the world. For the solution, the part of the solution for that problem, which requires only the scale and resources of the private sector, say, for example, expanding the coverage of a cell network in Mexico, a cell phone network, they will directly invest in a market rate investment in a cellular telephone company to expand their network coverage. If there's another part of that problem, for which the market doesn't have a full solution, they will make, what is called in the business a program-related investment, which is essentially a subsidized loan to a nonprofit or a group of nonprofits to basically correct for market conditions. And then if there's parts of that solution which there's no market whatsoever for, they'll just make a straight out grant, which is a very different way than a lot of foundations think of it. They'll just have to look at the problem. What's the nature of the problem? And what are these three levers we can use to try to solve the problem? And they call that blended finance. I'm not sure that's what the questioner was thinking.
Yeah, very interesting. I know that this is a practice that in Canada has not been very common, that the way in which MIDIR thinks about things. And that is partly to do with government regulation, which is not clear on things like program-related investing. Even impact investing, I think, broadly speaking, which hasn't been directly regulated by government, is problematic for a number of charitable foundations. Just not sure, how to use it effectively. I'd be interested to hear what Cathie and Helena have to say about this kind of blended finance question, and then I can come back with another observation I want to make about Canada. Cathie, Helena, do you have anything you want to add to the blended finance question?
Go ahead, Helena.
I have very little to add, but I think that impact investment can be one of the mechanisms to try to work on this more comprehensive understanding of democracy and how to increase the voice and the role of different communities in particular contexts. I think that on squarely defined democracy assistance, I think that the partnership with the private sector becomes more challenging because it is often seen as as related to commercial or investment benefits, etc. But I think that there is so much that can be done to empower and to build up the strength of communities. And I think that their impact investment can play a role.
That's great. I don't have anything to add except to say that at this moment, we're working on a pilot project to just get a sense of emerging areas of giving. And even beyond what we're talking about here, what are using blockchain, using crowdfunding, and so looking at individual giving in addition to philanthropy and the different ways that that's changing. And I think that that's, it's an important thing to keep in mind as funders and thinking about democracy funding for the very reasons that we just talked about, some of the structural issues that maybe there are some workarounds using different vehicles.
Thanks. Brad, I'm conscious of your time as well. I know you said you could stay for another 10 minutes. If you had any, I'm worried about your time constraint, if you had any final comments you wanted to make and then go, then
well, I just saw a question pop up about, which I was going to actually talk about a little bit about corporate citizenship, CSR, and multinational companies. Okay. This is something I think it's really worth keeping an eye on. And I know in the United States, we saw it after the murder of George Floyd. Very fast, there were very large commitments being made by corporations or high net worth individuals, faster than foundations. They moved much faster, and in some ways, kind of pushed the foundations into action. And this, kind of brand activism, which is one of the ways it's described, it's coming for a lot of reasons, and that's also a change in expectation of a generation of workers that are coming into the workforce around the world, actually, that expect more from the place they work than just a paycheck and being told what to do. They also want to know what the values of the company are. They want to know what the company's stands are and important issues of the day. And we're seeing actually, that corporations in some cases surprisingly have taken leadership roles that we wouldn't have expected them to make. And there's some of this going on in the Ukraine crisis. We're seeing that the people pulling out of Russia. I think it's Elon Musk with a Starlink system for Ukraine, and there's huge accountability issues in all this. Obviously, who are they accountable to? But that's maybe a whole another seminar. But I do think the assumption somehow that corporations sit outside of democracy and social justice and equality is no longer a safe assumption. We are seeing some pretty surprising and pretty progressive examples of corporate activism. So I think that's just an important thing to bring up. So.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Brad. And it maybe goes to another trend that we're seeing in Canada as younger people or another generation sort of comes into this, both the corporate and the nonprofit world. The strictures on charities and the regime, you referred to it earlier, the kind of common law regime that has framed what is charitable, what is appropriately charitable, what is okay or not okay for a charitable foundation, for example, to engage in. That framework has now become seriously out of step with what is reality, and I think a number of young people are talking about creating social enterprises or yes, going into full-on private sector work, but with a social purpose. So that the kind of blends that we're seeing now and the activism and the energy, are in that space, not in the sort of more constrained and constricted charitable world. And I think for foundations, that is the world I know best. It is becoming incredibly frustrating to be kind of confined to this little box when there is so much opportunity out there to do more. And that goes beyond, the questions of funding what might seem to be overtly political. I think, that I liked what Helena said about the anti-terrorism laws and, how constraining those are. Those work with the constraints of charity law to make it almost impossible for Canadian foundations to channel funds to organizations in countries where, yes, there might be a possibility of terrorism, but where there are so many grassroots organizations working to empower at the local level. And I think those constraints, that's where policymakers, if we have anybody in the audience today, who is in government right now and thinking about what they can do and, what policy changes are needed, it's thinking horizontally and thinking broadly about how that policy framework constrains or enables organizations that are registered as charities to do their work in a 21st century context, not a 19th century context. Sorry, I can get on a soapbox about this and I'll get off it now. We have other questions, I know. Michael, okay, do you want to ask one of the questions here?
Well, sure. First, I guess I have to underline, Brad, one more time what you said, because I actually just published a book on the corporate social responsibility engagement of companies also in this field, and corporate activism is definitely going to be one of the things we're going to have to figure out. And I think civil society is going to have to figure it out, and also philanthropy, because companies are taking on roles that normally NGOs have taken on. And that is one of the really interesting mishmashes we are getting right now. And that is something to be really, really looked at. And as you pointed out, the war in the Ukraine has shown this in a very interesting way. We see, and you also see this now in newspapers, etc. So it's really interesting to look at that. But there is another question here that has also been stated before on the question side. That's about the Summit of Democracy. And maybe here it is really to our American colleagues. How do you see that summit on democracy that is promoted by the State Department as a key driver for that kind of democracy movement? Or are you skeptical? What's your judgment on that development and that initiative?
I'll gladly let Cathie answer that.
I was going to say, I think my answer is short. Wait and see. After all the complexity that we've just discussed and the state of the world, I think, you know, it's good to be optimistic, and it's also good to see what the outcomes will be.
Just to clarify, I'm not American, I am Mexican.
I know.
But I'm sitting in for an American foundation. And I think that the Summit for Democracy, I mean, we still don't know what kind of promise it can deliver. And the commitments that were made by governments at the Summit for Democracy are very unequal. Canada had some very good commitments, had some commitments like closely related to civic space. I'm sure that my Canadian colleagues might have a different perspective, but there is such a range in whatever came out of the summit up to this point that it really is a matter of waiting to see if there will be if something will be delivered concretely. It sounds like the right initiative at a moment like this, but I don't know if it has all the political will that is needed by many different governments behind it.
Thank you.
I hope it has.
Yeah. Hillary, you want to take the next question?
Yeah, we have a question about the role of philanthropy in supporting or advocating for international standards of to uphold the free interchange of ideas, people, and funds. This is very aspirational. You know, the questioner says freedom of exchange is vital to address incumbency bias, intentionally or not entrenched in public assistance to democracy. So how do we think there is the emerging consensus in the donor community on these issues of upholding the free interchange of ideas, people, and funds? Is that something that any of you want to tackle? Keeping in mind what Brad said earlier about the diversity of views in the donor community.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, you know, a few things. In most countries where there is a, you know, sort of a formal philanthropic sector organized as, you know, foundations, it's highly segmented, just like the nonprofit world is. I mean, if you take the, you know, the more than close to 100,000 foundations, you know, private, independent, endowed foundations in the United States, you know, there's only about, I think it's about close to 1,200, 1,300 that have assets of over $100 million, where their endowment is 100 million or more. Now, at the far end of that is the Gates Foundation, which is like another genus or another species, right? Because it's so big. But then there's, you know, there's Ford, there's Mott, there's all these other ones. And then there are tens of thousands of foundations that, you know, are literally a husband, wife, and a checkbook. So when you're talking about philanthropy, now those big foundations account for a large portion of foundation giving. There is possibilities of mobilizing them, and there is, you know, a history of joint efforts among foundations to support, you know, a more open giving environment, to promote standards, to do exactly the kinds of things. And the other thing that's important is those large foundations, larger foundations in particular, play a very important role in supporting the infrastructure around philanthropy, which does a lot of this work. I mean, the center, the Lilly Center, is a good example of that. Candid, where I used to work, is a good example of that. We've heard about the International Center for Nonprofit Law. These are organizations that perform the very function the questioner is asking about over the overall environment, the rules, what the norm should be for good philanthropic practice. And they're heavily supported by these organizations. And I think it's an important lesson for philanthropists. You can't be a philanthropist without philanthropy. It's really important that people that enter into this as a professional pursuit and, to make the world a better, more just place, support the industry just like you would in any other industry. So it's, I think that's just an important part of the equation.
Yeah, well, that's music to my ears, Brad. But look at the example of Mackenzie Scott recently. She's been heavily supporting philanthropy's infrastructure. It's quite striking to see this. The unconditional grants that she's been making, clearly on advice from another advisor, an important advisor, the Bridgespan Group. But this is, I think, the example of an individual donor with huge means who is also taking philanthropy infrastructure seriously at the same time as she's giving to many grassroots organizations and many groups that represent the underrepresented or the minorities that we've been talking about.
And in reference to what Helena said earlier, her grants are general support grants.
Right.
And
right.
It throws everything about fundraising and philanthropy on its head, right? There's no application. You basically get an email or a phone call saying that,
right.
That Mackenzie Scott and Dan Jewett have decided to support you. And they're willing to restrict the grant if it's better for your organization. But the default is to make it unrestricted with extremely light reporting requirements. So this is really challenging a lot. And I think it's going to what Helena said. I mean, talk about trust-based philanthropy. There's probably no bigger, example than this.
Yeah, no, this is kind of earth-shaking in the philanthropy world for sure. Yeah. Helena, Cathie, any other thoughts about this question of, how one supports that infrastructure?
Yeah,
for democracy?
I just wanted to mention, I appreciated Brad's comments about the infrastructure in general. And I also wanted to just back up a little bit more because we look at, the entire ecosystem. And just to share, because yes, we can really advocate for, removing barriers and creating more incentives for giving. But just to kind of flip the view for a minute and think about the participants who are working or the recipients working in these difficult conditions, I wanted to share a quote from someone I hosted once that I think is just good to keep in mind. And I think it gets at this issue. He said, in my country, the government likes nonprofits that help it with poverty alleviation. Now, if you point out that there's poverty because the government didn't do something, they don't like that so much. And if you start a social movement, you go to jail. In the West, you're a hero, but at home, you're still in jail. So I just wanted to mention that because I think this is where looking at the entire ecosystem and really having this big picture is helpful because there are clearly these shared goals. And sometimes on the ground, the way they operationalize has to change. So I just wanted to mention that.
We're almost at the end of our time here, and I think we're losing or have lost Brad. But Helena, do you want to wrap up here before we finish with any closing thoughts here?
I think that overall, I want to underscore overall the relevance of, yes, investing in the infrastructure, investing in the institutions that will actually be able, and in the individuals. In Ford, always we talk about individuals, ideas, and institutions, and that will develop the vision of what our world can be tomorrow. And democracy is something that cannot be defined in squared ways because it is something that is in development and that looks very different today than it looked 50 years ago even in the countries that considered themselves to be democracies 50 years ago. So in reality, I think that there is so much space to contribute to people shaping the institutions that define their lives and to play a role in the decisions that will affect them. And the infrastructure that can be built in order to enable and support those processes is always essential. There is no way in which we can think about vibrant democracies without vibrant civil society. So in reality, investing, I mean, if we go back to the example that you put on the table of Mackenzie Scott and her investment in funds, like in all these mechanisms that will enable the resourcing of a series of movements that are a couple of layers down from where her investment hits, all of that is essential. And there is so much room to actually empower people to have a say. And I hope that Canada decides to lean into these opportunities and to step up in a moment in which the world needs it. We all need it because the deterioration is affecting gradually many different spheres of life. I mean, if I think of what Brad was saying at the beginning of media being within the categories of democracy assistance or not, I mean, the assault on media just makes it so very clear to what extent independent media is just critical and essential in a moment in which the post-truth is something that is out there constantly. So there are so many opportunities and so many possibilities. And a government that is committed can deconstruct many of the constraints that it has built into its own legislation and many of the restrictive ways, like Brad was saying, that it uses to interpret other legislations in order to really give people a chance to play a role.
That's actually a great example, Helena, because and bringing it back to the current situation, Philanthropy and Reporters Without Borders, for instance, just initiated JX Fund, European Fund for Journalism in Exile, to support especially Russian and Belarus journalists to still be able to do journalism. And now Gabriela is already jumping in here and showing her face. That must be the sign that we're done with our time. That's a topic I think Hillary and Cathie and Helena and I could talk for ages, and also with Brad and the many people online. Gabrielle, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I have been looking forward to this conversation for months, and it did not disappoint. I appreciate everyone's contributions. Hillary and Michael, you have made my job so easy. I've been able to focus on taking notes furiously here. One statistic that jumped out at me that I just had to share, Brad noted that between 2011 and 2013, almost $14 billion were contributed in the US for democracy-related support. The annual budget of USAID, State Department, NED, all combined is $2 billion per year. This is a stunning, it's a staggering number, and it's even made more so by the fact that we know so little about it between the sectors. So I'm just so grateful for being able to learn about this today, and for wishing I could talk to you all for many more hours to come. Thank you so much. I will turn it over to Tom. Please do look at our website in the chat for our upcoming dialogues. We have an exciting opportunity to nominate young people working in this field for a chance to be featured on this series. I really hope that all of you here will take a moment to throw some names in that bin. We'd love to get talented young people on the screen later this spring. Thank you so much, and Tom.
Thank you. I want to offer my thanks as well to each and every one of you, and to Brad, who's left. A very thought-provoking discussion. I have a feeling there'll be follow-ups, and I'm really glad that we've entered into this space. I think Helena in particular, talking about the need to define democracy support in practical ways. We see so much connection between any initiatives that address a policy issue, whether it's hunger, climate change, education. These are governance issues. These are issues that need to be dealt with by democratic institutions, and oftentimes there's a gap. So there's clearly opportunities to make these connections and to ensure that there's some stability, some long-term sustainability built into assistance, whether it's private or public. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure our viewers did as well. It'll be available for review as well. We've recorded the session, so thank you very much for your participation today.
It was a pleasure, really.
Thank you so much for having me.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thanks, bye. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.